So here you are, welcome to Rome, the heart of an empire, a city of marble and fire, where gods walk in sandals and senators debate philosophy while belching over honeyed dormice. And you are property now, a beautiful piece of property. At that, congratulations. Let's rewind a moment. You weren't always a concubine. You might have been a shepherd's boy in the hills of Gaul, a fisherman's son from the Ionian coast, maybe even a street kid who danced for bread in Antioch. But someone saw you. Maybe they noticed your eyes, maybe your skin, maybe the way you moved. Either way, you were noticed, and that's where the trouble began. You were taken, bought, gifted. It doesn't really matter. The story starts the same. One day, you had a name, and the next, you had a collar. Roman slavery wasn't just about farms and mines. It had levels. There were scribes, cooks, gladiators, tutors, and then there were delicati. That's you now. A delicate one. The term sounds soft, maybe even affectionate. But don't be fooled. It meant you were chosen for your beauty, for your youth, and for your ability to be looked at, touched, and used. They don't ask if you're willing. They assume your silence means consent. You're brought into the domus, the sprawling villa of your new master. There are columns, mosaics, slaves everywhere. But you're different. You're not here to scrub floors or pour wine. You're here to be seen, to be touched, to be kept. There's a room for you, not a cell. Exactly. Not a suite either, somewhere in between. The walls are painted with birds and gods. There's incense in the air, a marble basin for washing. Silks you're meant to wear, but not for your comfort. They don't want you warm. They want you presentable. A eunuch shows you around. His eyes don't meet yours for long. You can tell he's seen many like you before. You ask where you'll be sleeping. He gestures to a lounge with velvet cushions. Where you're told, he says. Then he adds, almost gently, and never in your own bed. You learn the rules quickly. Rule 1, smile, even when you don't want to. Rule 2, don't speak unless spoken to. Rule 3, never say no. Rule 4, bathe, constantly. Perfume is poured into your bathwater. Oils are rubbed into your skin until you gleam like a statue. You're expected to smell like a dream and behave like one too soft. Passive, unthreatening. You're brought to parties, not as a guest, as decoration. The guests are older men senators, generals, poets with dangerous eyes. They drink heavily, they laugh loudly, and when they look at you, it's with a hunger that has nothing to do with food. Sometimes, they beckon you closer with a crooked finger. Sometimes, they don't bother beckoning. You're simply led. Your master doesn't watch, or maybe he does. You can't tell which is worse. If you're lucky, they talk to you. If you're really lucky, they forget you're there. Your first night isn't memorable. It's forgettable by design. You don't cry. You don't scream. You go still. You go blank. You learn to breathe in time with the sound of the fountain outside the window. You're not the first. You won't be the last. You meet others like you. Boys with hollow smiles. Girls who flinch at laughter. They speak in whispers. If they speak at all. Some are younger. Some older. None of them last long. You ask one where he's from. He shrugs. It doesn't matter anymore. And maybe he's right. Because Rome doesn't care where you came from. Rome cares only what you are. You are young. You are attractive. You are disposable. Your master gives you a bracelet one morning. Bold. Too large for your wrist. He says it means you belong to him. Officially. You ask what happens if you take it off. He smiles like a wolf and says, why would you ever want to? That night, you dream of home. Whatever home was. The food is good. That's the strange part. Roasted figs. Cheese. Warm bread. You eat better than most citizens. But the price is everything else. Freedom is rationed. Touch is currency. Your body, not yours anymore. Sometimes, you wonder how long this will last. The others say there's no set time. Some are favored for a few seasons. Some for years. Some until they fall ill, or grow too old, or stop being interesting. You ask what happens then. They shrug. You'll be sold. You'll be cast out. Or you'll be replaced so quietly you don't even realize you've become invisible. The villa is full of statues of Apollo, Ganymede, Narcissus, perfect male bodies carved in white stone. Sometimes, you feel like one of them. Adored, but frozen. Worshipped, but silent. Beautiful, but not alive. A philosopher visits one night and gives a toast. To youth, the sweetest wine. Everyone laughs. You look around the room and wonder who else realizes you're the wine. You wish someone would notice the bitterness, but no one ever does. Let's be honest. In ancient Rome, being beautiful was dangerous, especially if you were young, male, and enslaved. especially if your beauty made powerful men forget your name and remember only your skin. You didn't ask for this. You didn't chase it. You just looked a certain way. And in Rome, that look was a sentence. You find this out gradually, in the side glances, the uninvited touches, the way you're summoned without words, like a favorite cup or a pleasing statue. Your worth is not in what you say or know, it's in how you look when you're silent. You thought, perhaps, beauty would make life easier. After all, the beautiful are loved. That's what the stories say, right? But no one told you that in Rome, beauty doesn't protect. It exposes. You remember the first time someone pinched your cheek in public? Not playfully, possessively. You smiled because you were supposed to. You hated yourself for it. The crowd laughed. A senator said you had a face for the gods. And suddenly you realized you were no longer seen as a person. You were a surface, a painting, a possession, a prize. The other slaves whisper warnings. One tells you, don't make eye contact for too long. That's an invitation. Another says, don't smile too brightly. It makes them want to see you weep. You try to be invisible, but beauty doesn't let you hide. You start learning how to carry yourself just so, straight enough to seem proud, but not defiant. Eyes downcast, but not dull. Available, but not eager. It's an impossible performance, and you perform it every day. You're dressed in sheer tunics, sometimes in nothing at all, depending on your master's whim. Jewelry is draped across your body, not for status, but to frame you, like pearls around a throat meant for display. Once, during a banquet, someone spills wine on you on purpose. It soaks through the thin linen. The laughter is immediate, sharp, hungry. A guest says, now that's art. You're ordered not to change. You stand there, wet and humiliated, until they're done looking. Beauty, you learn, is not a blessing here. It is a trap. And like all traps, it closes slowly. Without you realizing you've stepped inside, you become fluent in silence. You learn how to disappear in the center of a room, how to freeze your face while someone comments on your lips as if you can't hear, how to take a compliment that feels like a threat and nod as though it's poetry. They say things like, you should be grateful many would kill for your face. You want to ask if they'd also like to kill for your freedom, but you don't. You've seen what happens to those who speak out. There's a boy named Lucio, 2 years older than you, who used to belong to a different household. He was beautiful, 2 sharp cheekbones, golden eyes. Then one day, he said no, or flinched, or hesitated. No one knows exactly. He was found the next morning, thrown in the Tiber. No one claimed his body. No one said his name. Beauty had made him desirable, but it hadn't made him safe. You stop dreaming of being loved. That kind of love doesn't exist here. What exists is usefulness, and beauty is your only tool. So you polish it. You perform it. You weaponize it if you can. You learn to flirt without hope, to seduce without desire, to survive without feeling. At night, when the villa is finally quiet, you sit by the window and wonder how something so simple, your face, your form, has become a burden you can't put down. You think of Narcissus, the boy in the myth who fell in love with his own reflection. But here's the twist. You didn't choose the mirror. Someone held it in front of you, and now you're expected to stare at it forever. One afternoon, during a visit from a traveling poet, your master orders you to recite verses while reclining by the fountain. You speak the lines clearly, elegantly, but the poet doesn't applaud your diction. He praises the way the sun strikes your collarbone. He writes a poem about it. Doesn't include your name. Later, you hear it performed in the forum. The crowd swoons. They call you the muse. You smile like it's flattering, but inside, you feel yourself fading, reduced to metaphor and meter. At dinner that night, the poet requests your company. You are sent, perfumed and silent. You know what's expected? You wonder if the poem will be different afterward. It isn't. Time passes. You begin to age just slightly. A softness at the jaw, a stretch of skin under the eyes. Nothing anyone else would notice. But your master does. He begins looking at someone new. A younger boy, thinner, blonder. You try not to stare. The next week, your bracelet is removed. You're told you're being reassigned. No explanation. No discussion. The new household is smaller, less wealthy, less cruel, perhaps, but also less enchanted by your presence. You are no longer a marvel. You are used. Beauty got you everything, and now it gets you nothing. You meet a girl in the new villa. She's quiet, efficient, older than you by maybe 10 years. You ask her how she survived. She says, I stopped trying to be beautiful. I started trying to be invisible. And that's when it hits you. In Rome, the price of being pretty wasn't admiration or attention. It was ownership. And once your beauty faded, you were still a slave. But now, with fewer protections, and fewer illusions. You walk past a mirror one day. You don't stop. You already know what it says. It didn't always start with a cage. Sometimes it started with citizenship. You might have once been free, a child born in a quiet village far from Rome under the sun, under olive trees, under the assumption that your life would follow the slow rhythm of the seasons. You chased goats, ate flatbread with honey, and maybe even had dreams, simple ones, livable ones. And then something changed. A war broke out, or your father died in debt, or the taxes rose while your village starved. Rome had a way of absorbing people, not just their land, not just their food, but their bodies. You remember the day it happened. The soldiers came. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply pointed. You were 16, maybe, or 15. It doesn't matter. One of them looked at your face and smiled in a way that made your skin crawl. They didn't ask if you wanted to go. They asked if anyone would miss you. They were sure the answer was no. At first, you didn't understand what was happening. You thought you were being taken to work, maybe to serve in a kitchen, maybe to be trained for something useful. You told yourself it wouldn't be that bad. Then you saw the collar. Then you felt it on your neck. Then you saw how they looked at you. That's when the word changed. You stopped being a person. You became a commodity, a thing to be traded, cleaned, decorated. You were placed in a line with others, naked, on display, your body poked, prodded, commented upon like livestock. An old man pressed your hips. A younger one examined your teeth. A woman asked to see you walk, turn, kneel. You did all of it because you had already learned what happened to those who didn't. A bid was placed, not on your skills, not on your knowledge, on your appearance. You were sold like fine fruit. You heard someone say, a delicate one, still green, should keep well for at least a few years. You wanted to scream. Instead, you smiled. That smile would become your armor, your mask, your lie. They took you to the city, Rome glorious, endless, smothering Rome. You'd imagined it once, when stories passed through your village, marble statues, golden temples, fountains that sang. You saw those things, but you also saw the other side, the filth in the alleys, the fear in the eyes of servants, the silence of slaves who had forgotten how to hope. They led you through the gates of a villa larger than your entire village. You were washed, scraped, perfumed. Your hair was curled, your nails cleaned. You were redressed not as a laborer but as an object of pleasure. Silks, oils, jewels not to elevate you, but to mark you. A sign hung around your neck for a time. A name you didn't recognize. A new name? Because your old one had no value now. The master your new owner watched as you were presented. He nodded, smiled slightly, said you would do. Then he turned and walked away, as if you were a chair delivered exactly as ordered. The first few days were strange. No hard labor, no shoveling or scrubbing, just lessons. How to walk in silence, how to sit without creasing your tunic, how to serve fruit to a reclining guest without making eye contact. They taught you how to fold yourself into beauty. You asked what your role would be. A steward laughed and said, "You'll figure it out tonight." And you did. The master called for you after dinner. You didn't eat that night. The next morning, you bled a little, but no one asked if you were in pain. They only asked if you could still walk. They made sure the bruises wouldn't show. The face had to remain pristine. The body, that belonged to him now. Eventually, you learned how to compartmentalize. You pushed your mind away when he entered the room. You taught yourself how to float inside yourself, far enough from the pain to keep smiling, close enough to remember your lines. You weren't a person. You were a performance. A citizen might sue their attacker. A citizen might weep for justice. But you were no longer protected by law. You were no longer protected by anything. Once, in a market, you saw a Roman boy your age, freeborn, laughing with his father as they inspected olives. His tunic was wrinkled, his teeth uneven, his arms sunburned. No one cared. You realized he was allowed to be imperfect. You were not. Your value depended on remaining untouched by time, by trauma, by truth. But the truth had already carved itself into you. You saw it in the mirror, in the hollows forming under your eyes, in the tightness of your smile, in the way your shoulders had learned to curl just slightly inward, defensively, even when you were alone. Sometimes, when the household was quiet, you'd sneak away to the back courtyard. There was a broken statue of Mercury there. His face had cracked clean in two. You'd sit beside him and whisper your real name, the one no one used anymore, the one you were starting to forget yourself. And you'd ask him, was I ever free? Was I ever a boy? Or was I always just something waiting to be sold? The statue never answered, but the silence felt honest, more honest than anything you'd heard since the collar closed. You were once a citizen. Now, You were currency. In the hands of Rome, even your breath belonged to someone else. And the price was everything from the outside. The villa looked like paradise. Tall marble columns, gardens filled with citrus and laurel, fountains that whispered over polished stone, the scent of myrrh wafting through air heavy with wealth. People would pause on the street just to stare at the grand iron gate. They'd point, they'd admire, they'd envy. But you knew better. Because once you were inside, once that gate shut behind you, it didn't open again. Not for you. Your new home was beautiful. Yes, but so is a cage when you fill it with gold. The chains are still chains. Even if they shine, the villa had layers. Like a well-decorated onion. You were not permitted in all of them. Certain wings were off limits. Certain doors were locked unless summoned. There were places for cooking, washing, sleeping, praying, and entertaining. But there was nowhere for freedom. You slept where you were told, which was sometimes a linen-covered bench in your master's study, sometimes a cushion in the atrium, and sometimes, if he was feeling generous, an empty guest room with no latch on the door. You weren't allowed to close doors. That was a privilege of citizens. You learned the geography of your prison quickly, which stones were warmest at dawn, which corners were best for hiding when you needed to cry, which fountains muffled sound, which statues you could speak to without being overheard. You weren't alone. There were others' servants, cooks, scribes, stewards, but you were the only delicatess. They called you the favorite, but not with admiration. With pity, sometimes with disgust. The cook, a gruff old Greek, once warned you, the wine may be sweet, but don't forget where the cup is kept. You didn't know what that meant at first, but you learned. You learned what it meant to be poured out nightly, drained of dignity, and set on a shelf until needed again. The villa was full of life. Music, laughter, feasts. You were dressed and presented during these gatherings, draped in fine fabrics, decorated like a table centerpiece. Not too bold, never distract from the master, but always just noticeable enough to invite attention. Who's that? A guest might ask. Oh, that's mine. Your master would say, with the casual pride of someone showing off a rare coin. They never said your name. Only that. Theirs. You were trained to anticipate his needs. A tilt of his wine cup meant refill. A raised eyebrow meant approach. A frown meant you'd failed. Sometimes it meant worse. There were punishments, of course, subtle ones. You were never struck in front of guests. That would be vulgar. But there were other ways. Denied meals. Locked doors. Cold baths. Long silences. A fingernail pressed too hard into your shoulder when you stood too far. A whispered command with no room for refusal. You told yourself it could be worse. And that was the trick. The villa made you grateful for your prison, because the walls were high, but the ceilings were painted with stars. The food was rich, though it turned to ash in your mouth. You slept on silk sheets, even as your mind curled into itself at night, hiding in shadows. There was a garden behind the villa, small, but perfect. Olive trees, roses, a stone path shaped like a spiral. Your master liked to walk there in the early evening, draped in his toga, sipping spiced wine. He'd take you with him, sometimes, not to talk, just to walk one step behind him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he asked, "Do you like it here?" You didn't answer right away. He stopped walking. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. "Yes, master," you replied. He smiled. "Good. I give you everything." And in a way, he wasn't wrong. He gave you food, clothes, shelter. He just took everything else. You weren't allowed visitors. Letters weren't permitted. You couldn't read. But even if you could, there were no books for you. Your conversations were rehearsed and brief. Your laughter was expected on command. Your tears were only acceptable in silence. Sometimes, you imagined running. You pictured slipping out through the servants' entrance, past the stables, over the wall, disappearing into the night, starting over. But then you remembered you didn't exist on paper. No name, no status, no rights. Outside the villa, you were prey. Inside, you were a pet, the lesser of two horrors. There was a young girl, once a kitchen maid, who dared to flee. They caught her at the edge of the city. Her feet were bleeding, her tunic torn. They paraded her back in front of everyone. The master didn't shout. He simply nodded to a guard. She disappeared. No one asked where. The next morning, the atrium was scrubbed especially hard. And the garden, it smelled like iron for weeks. So you stayed. Because the villa was beautiful. Because fear can look like loyalty if you wear it long enough. Because gilded bars still hold tight. And because by now, you'd forgotten what open air tasted like. Sometimes, when the moon was full, you'd sit near the back gate and look through the iron bars. Beyond them, the world stretched wide, messy, loud, free. And you wondered, what would it be like to walk through that gate not as property, not as prey, but as a person? But the wind never answered. Only the villa did. Its marble floors whispered, "Stay polished, stay pretty, stay silent." And you did, because you'd learned the most important rule of your new life. The villa always wins. By now, you've learned how things work in the villa. You know where to stand, how to bow, when to smile. But there's still one lesson left to understand, and it's not written on any wall or whispered in any official order. It's the unspoken hierarchy of pleasure. You feel it more than you see it at first. The way the master's hand lingers a little longer on some than others. The way one servant gets new shoes while another is denied dinner. You realize, quickly, that not all concubines are equal. There's a system. It's not based on age, not entirely, or skill, or obedience. It's based on interest. The master's interest, his mood, his preferences, which change like Roman weather, hot one moment, cold the next, thunder by midnight. And you, poor soul, are expected to anticipate the forecast. At the top of the hierarchy is the current favorite. You've been there. Once, briefly. It's not a place, it's a spotlight. A brief, dazzling illusion of importance. For a moment, you are the center of his gaze. He speaks to you at dinner. He chooses you for walks. He calls you by a name, maybe not your real one, but something softer than boy. Something that makes you feel dangerously like you matter. But it's a trap, because the favorite is also the most exposed. You are watched, critiqued, expected to perform not just physically, but emotionally. You must appear grateful, flattered, honored. Even as your body aches and your thoughts curl inward like burned paper, the others notice your rise. Some envy, some pity. A few hate you outright, not because of who you are, but because they know what's coming. Because favorites don't stay favorites forever. Below you are the standbys, those who once held the spotlight and now live in its shadow. Their smiles are sharper, their compliments backhanded. They offer advice that sounds helpful but drips with warning. Don't look him in the eye when he's quiet. Don't wear blue. He hated it last week. Don't ever mention poetry. His last favorite liked poetry. You realize quickly that everything you do is a comparison to someone who came before you, and someone who will come after. Then there are the novices, the newly acquired. They arrive quiet, stunned, still holding on to the edge of innocence. Their skin unmarked, their backs straight. They don't yet know how to walk without swinging their arms. They haven't learned the art of appearing desirable without seeming too eager. You watch them and remember when that was you. You want to warn them? You don't, because warning them would mean admitting what you've become. At the very bottom are the discarded, the too old, the no longer pretty, the ones with scars that don't fade and smiles that no longer convince. They're not sent away. That would be too generous. They are kept for utility, cleaning, errands, perhaps to be offered to guests less important than the master. They exist as reminders. This is your future. If you live that long, one day, you're summoned along with two others, Nico and Darius. Both are older than you, both former favorites. You're brought to the master's chamber. He's reclining on a couch, sipping wine with a general visiting from the frontier. The general looks sunburnt and cruel. He glances at the three of you like selecting cuts of meat. The master nods toward you. New, he says, untouched. A lie. Of course, but a marketable one. You're chosen. The general doesn't ask your name. Later, when he falls asleep, you slip back to your own room, bruised and silent. Nico is waiting outside. He doesn't speak. He just nods. He knows what it means to be picked, and what it costs. That night, you lie awake and wonder if anyone in this villa feels anything anymore. There's no friendship among the concubines, no solidarity, just competition. You smile at each other during the day and dream of each other's dismissal at night. Because in a system like this, the only way up is if someone else goes down. You once asked an older servant, one of the discarded, how long he had served. He shrugged. Long enough to know it doesn't matter. Did he love you? You asked, foolishly. The man laughed. Not kindly. He loved what I did for him. And when I stopped doing it well enough, he found someone else who could. You wanted to ask what happened then. But you already knew. You see it in the way he limps, in the way no one speaks his name, in the way he fades into the background of the villa like worn wallpaper. You start keeping track. Who's rising? Who's falling? You notice Nico eating less. Darius pretending to limp so he's not called at night. One boy, a small one, barely 13, has taken to hiding in the laundry alcove. They find him eventually. They always do. The villa hums with ritual. Each night is a performance. Each smile a mask. Each touch a transaction. And through it all, you play your part. Because you've learned the rules of this hierarchy. You've learned that in Rome, pleasure is never mutual. It is imbalance made flesh. It is power draped in silk. It is desire fed by fear. And somewhere, deep down, you still hope that if you play it right, if you please well enough, you might be spared. But you won't, because this hierarchy doesn't end in freedom. It ends in silence, in bruises, in vanishing. And you're just one more delicate body on a staircase made of other delicate bodies. You climb it with grace, because there's nowhere else to go. If one morning you had decided to scream, truly scream into the marbled walls of that villa, who would have come running? A steward, a guard, perhaps another concubine. And if they did come, what then? Would they help you? Or would they ask why you were being loud? The answer is simple. They wouldn't help, because the law was never on your side. You learned that the hard way. It's strange, isn't it? Rome, that great civilization, the one that birthed the Republic, that crowned itself with law and justice and the pride of order. They loved to talk about virtues, dignitas, and libertas, but none of those applied to you. Not once, not ever, because you were a thing. And Roman law had plenty of rules for things, but not many protections, especially not for pleasure slaves. In fact, your very existence was made legal by Rome's most respected thinkers. Cicero once argued that certain people were natural slaves, destined by their inferiority to serve the superior. Aristotle in Greece had started the idea. Rome perfected it. And even if you weren't born a slave, even if you were kidnapped, conquered, or sold by a starving parent once you entered that house, that villa, that system, the law ceased to recognize your humanity. You became res property, like a spoon, or a horse, or a statue, breakable, replaceable, usable. You think back to when you first heard that word in a muttered legal document. Res, a steward read it out loud, squinting at the parchment. The subject has been classified as res privata, the personal property of the dominus, not a person. A subject, you had no right to say no. No legal standing if harmed. No testimony that could be trusted in court. If you were raped, it wasn't a crime, because under Roman law, rape was defined as a violation of honor, and you, being enslaved and used for pleasure, had no honor to violate. If you were beaten, it wasn't abuse, it was discipline. If you were killed, it was a loss of investment, nothing more. There were documents, so many scrolls and tablets explaining exactly how much you were worth. The price of a delicatus varied by age, beauty, obedience, and rarity. You once overheard a senator say, "I paid more for him than I did for my last villa, at least this one smiles." And everyone laughed, including your master, including you, because you knew better than not to. Slaves in Rome had one thin, fragile strand of hope: manumission, the act of being freed, a ceremony, often small, where the master gave up his ownership and declared the slave a freedman. It happened sometimes, usually after decades of loyal service. Sometimes if the master was unusually kind or unusually guilty. You dreamed of it once, of hearing your name spoken before a magistrate, of receiving the cap of liberty, being allowed to walk the streets without fear. But you learned quickly that concubines were rarely freed. Why would they be? You weren't a craftsman. You weren't a laborer with skills to offer. Your value was in being owned. Your freedom would make you inconvenient, a risk, a reminder. And no Roman aristocrat liked reminders of their appetites. One day, a guest of the household, a minor noble from the provinces, became enraged during a feast, wine-soaked and jealous. He accused his own slave of being impure. No one asked what he meant. They didn't need to. He dragged the boy outside. You heard the crack of the whip before you saw it. The boy's screams echoed down the stone corridors. And the law said nothing, because he owned him. You wanted to look away, but you didn't. You watched, because you needed to remember, because if it happened to you, you wanted to know what was coming. Once, long ago, when you were still fresh and full of hope, you asked another concubine, "Has anyone ever taken their master to court? Ever gotten justice?" He looked at you for a long time. Then he said, "No, but one jumped from the roof." That, you learned, was as close as justice got. They'd tried to stop the boy. Too late. He landed in the atrium fountain, red in the water. The guests were furious not because of the death, but because dinner had to be moved. Later, you passed by the spot and saw the mosaic had been cleaned. No blood, no sign of the body, just a few cracked tiles. That's all that remained of his resistance. Even in death, there were no trials, no funerals, just silence. One evening, your master had friends over. One of them asked, "Why not just marry someone instead of keeping these pets?" Your master laughed, "Because wives have rights." They all nodded. They all understood. A wife could speak in court. You could not. A wife could say no. You could not. A wife could shame her husband. You could only shame yourself. So you stood in the corner, candlelight flickering against your jeweled collar, and you smiled. Because the law wasn't just indifferent. It was complicit. It didn't ignore your pain. It enabled it. You weren't living outside the system. You were the system's product. And even if Rome fell tomorrow, even if the villa burned, even if the Senate collapsed into dust, as long as there were those who turned beauty into bondage, performance into punishment, and desire into ownership, there would be no justice for people like you. Only stories whispered at night. Only memories pressed into stone. Only boys like you, watching the stars and wondering if they, too, are owned by someone. You probably thought about running. Every slave in Rome did at some point. Even those pampered in silk and perfume, especially them. Because sometimes comfort is more suffocating than hunger. Because safety, when barbed with expectation, feels like a leash made of gold. The first time you imagined escape, you were staring out through the villa's side courtyard. The sunset hit the stone walls just right. There was a crack in the iron gate, tiny, insignificant, but it became a doorway in your mind. You could slip through, disappear into the shadows, fade into the chaos of the streets. You could breathe. You could be yourself again. But that dream lasted only seconds. Reality came quickly, like it always did. You had nowhere to go. No money. No name. No one waiting. And worse, no protection. Because escaping wasn't just running. It was abandoning your role, your purpose, your illusion of safety. It meant choosing to be hunted, chosen to be hurt. Roman law made it very clear. A runaway slave was a criminal. You'd be branded if caught, flogged, sometimes killed as an example. Your master had every right to punish you however he wished. And the public, they would help him. There were rewards for recapturing fugitives, posters nailed to city walls, descriptions shouted in marketplaces. You remember one such poster? It described a runaway pleasure boy. Small frame, curly hair, shy demeanor. You stared at it longer than you should have, heart thudding, before realizing it wasn't about you, but it could have been. You asked a servant once, quietly, what happened to the ones who run? She just shook her head. They stopped mattering. You learned the stories. Though, one boy tried climbing over the eastern wall. He fell, broke his ankle, couldn't run. They dragged him back and locked him in the wine cellar for a week. When he came out, he was quiet, too quiet. His smile was strange after that, hollow, like something had been taken and never returned. Another slipped away during a festival, made it all the way to the outskirts of Rome. He was caught at a checkpoint. A soldier recognized the brand on his shoulder. They brought him back on a cart, tied, bloodied. You saw the cart. You saw the fear in every concubine's face that night. No one spoke. No one dared. Escape wasn't just a gamble. It was a suicide mission wrapped in hope. But still you dreamed. You imagined slipping into a tradesman's clothes, cutting your hair, changing your name, hiding in some distant province where no one asked questions, maybe even pretending to be freeborn. Perhaps, if you were lucky, you could find work at a bathhouse or inn, maybe even earn a wage, maybe even live. But it was always a maybe, and always far away. Because Rome was a web, and you were wrapped tight in its silk. Even the people who might help you wouldn't. If someone took you in, they'd be accused of theft. They could be fined, imprisoned. So most turned you in not because they hated you, but because they didn't want to be caught in your fall. Even freeborn Romans could feel trapped. You were just another whisper in the alleys. One day, a new concubine arrived, fresh, frightened, younger than you'd ever been. He asked if it was true if anyone had ever escaped successfully. You told him, softly. One did. He lit up. Really? You nodded. He ran so fast, no one could catch him. Disappeared into the mountains, became a shepherd, grew a beard, found peace. Wow, the boy whispered. Do you think he's still alive? You paused, then said, I hope so. But you knew the truth. That story wasn't real. It was one of many passed between boys like myths, a fable, a lifeline, something to cling to when the walls pressed too tightly. Because hope, even if false, was better than nothing. Because the truth was that escape was a fantasy. And deep down, even the bravest of you knew it. So instead of running, you learned to disappear in place. You got quieter, smiled more often, anticipated needs before they were spoken. You faded at the right moments. You laughed when expected, wept only in secret, and kept your thoughts behind a practiced blankness that passed for obedience. In a way, that was its own kind of escape. Not from the villa, not from Rome, but from yourself. Because if you could forget who you had been, you could survive who you had become. You met an old man once a slave long past his prime, kept only because no one remembered to dismiss him. He sat by the garden wall every afternoon, feeding sparrows crumbs from his rationed bread. Did you ever try to run? You asked one day. He didn't answer, just held up his hands. Both wrists were twisted. Broken long ago? Never set properly. Then he said, they can only catch you if they know who you are. And you understood. He had stopped being a person long before his body gave out. He had escaped. Not through roads, but through erasure. That night, you lay in your thin bed and stared at the ceiling. It was painted with stars, little golden dots in perfect circles, beautiful, useless. And for the first time, you realized even the ceiling lied to you, because stars don't shimmer in Rome. They're just decorations in a cage. And dreams. Dreams are only safe when you don't try to live them. By now, you knew the routine. The oil lamps lit just before dusk. The rush of servants laying out cushions and fruit bowls. Gold-trimmed goblets polished until you could see your own haunted eyes. Musicians tuning instruments in the peristyle. Laughter echoing down marble halls like a slow-building storm. When your master hosted, the entire villa transformed from quiet cruelty to theater. And you were the performance. You learned that Roman dinner parties weren't just about eating. They were about spectacle, about status, about reminding everyone in attendance who had power and who didn't. And there was no stronger flex of power than owning someone beautiful, obedient, and just tragic enough to make the wine taste sweeter. The first time you were summoned to one of these convivia, you thought you were just serving wine? You wore a short tunic, no belt, one shoulder exposed. You carried a tray of figs and honey. You smiled when expected, but you quickly realized you weren't there to serve. You were there to be seen. The guests ogled you like a novelty. They made jokes in Greek and laughed before you could understand. One senator called you Venus in disguise. Another said he'd like to test your loyalty. You didn't reply. You'd been warned not to. And at the head of the room, your master watched it all with amusement, swirling his wine, playing the host with impeccable charm. He didn't need to touch you. They were doing it for him. There was a hunger in the air, one that food couldn't satisfy. A glint in every guest's eye that said, "What can I get away with tonight?" And the answer was anything. Because no one cared what you wanted. Because you were part of the decor. What the guests really wanted wasn't pleasure. It was permission. Permission to speak vile things in polite company. To mock and tease without consequence. To enjoy your beauty without acknowledging your humanity. Sometimes you'd be brought out after the meal, draped in a new robe, told to recite lines you'd been forced to memorize. Poetry, philosophy, or worse, your own story, stylized for entertainment. They asked questions like, "Where are you from?" But they didn't care about the answer. They asked, "Do you miss your family?" Then laughed when you hesitated. They wanted to see you flinch, wanted to see the shimmer of a tear you wouldn't let fall. That made you real, but only for a moment, before they turned you back into a fantasy again. One night, a guest reached for you without asking. You froze. Your master raised an eyebrow not at the guest, but at you. You understood, so you didn't pull away. You never did again. The guests came from every corner of society's senators, generals, poets, priests, some young, some wrinkled, some reeking of incense, others of arrogance. But they all shared the same look when they entered the room. Entitlement. They had paid for their seat at the table either with gold or loyalty, and now they expected entertainment. And you had no choice but to comply. There were rules, of course, not on parchment, but unwritten codes whispered through the house. Never say no. Never cry in front of the guests. Never speak unless spoken to. Never refuse a toast. Never interrupt laughter. Never, ever act like you're in pain, because if you did, the guests might be offended, and if they were offended, your master would be displeased. And that was a far worse fate than any wandering hand or cruel remark. You learned to laugh at your own expense, to deliver flattery as though it were your own idea, to look at these men as if they were gods and you were grateful for the attention. You were not a person. You were a mirror, a reflection of their own superiority. And when they left, drunk and smug, you weren't dismissed. You were critiqued. Your master would comment. You held the tray too stiffly. You didn't bow deeply enough. You looked bored. He never asked if you were okay. That wasn't part of the arrangement. Because in the eyes of these men, you weren't serving dinner. You were part of the menu. One guest, a famous writer, once told your master, "He's got the eyes of a deer and the silence of a statue." Perfect. They all agreed. You smiled. Inside, you crumbled. Sometimes they asked for you by name, or rather, by the nickname they gave you, Lumen, meaning light, not your real name. That had been buried long ago. You tried to remember it once. Your real name, the one from before. but it slipped away like a dream you can't quite hold. So now, when someone calls Lumen, you answer because that's who they want. And what they want, they get. You watched others rise and fall in this strange theater. One girl was clever with words too clever. She corrected a guest misquote once. She disappeared the next day. One boy had a limp from a childhood injury. They laughed when he tripped carrying wine. Later, the guards corrected his posture with a stick. Another concubine, older than most, had stopped smiling. The guests complained. She was given kitchen duties the next week. You never saw her again. This wasn't about beauty. It was about performance. And every guest expected a flawless act. You used to pray that a kind guest would take pity on you. That maybe, one night, someone would see through the mask and offer you freedom. But they never did. Because the guests didn't want reality. They wanted illusion. And you were the perfect illusion. Trained, scripted, disposable. The wine flowed, the music played, and every night, the show went on. Because what the guests really wanted was to leave without consequences. And you were the price of their amnesia. It starts so small. A lingering touch, a softer tone, a look that holds yours a second too long. For a moment brief, flickering, you wonder if this is what kindness feels like. The master's fingers brush your jaw after a performance. He says, "Good boy." 2 words that hit you harder than any slap ever could. Because you've been starved for approval. You cling to those syllables like bread. Then he asks you to stay. Not with a command this time. A request. As if you had a choice. You don't, but the illusion of a choice is intoxicating. That's the weapon. Affection becomes a blade dressed in silk. You sit beside him on the couch while the others clean. He lets you drink from his cup, tells you you're his favorite, his special one. He strokes your hair like you're some exotic pet. You want to recoil, but your body betrays you, leans in, craves the warmth, even as it burns. Because after months, years of being nothing, even the pretense of love feels like salvation. And that's how it begins. Not with chains, but with crumbs. He gives you a better tunic, a private room, lets you eat fresh dates instead of dried ones. The other concubines notice. They whisper behind cupped hands. Envy, resentment, fear. You've risen too fast. But you don't care, because now you're seen, and being seen is all you ever wanted. He takes you on outings now. Not into the city, of course you're still property, but to the gardens, the private orchards, once, to a secluded villa near the coast. You breathe salt air and almost believe you're free. He calls you by a name he made up for you, Bellis. Beautiful. And for a while, you pretend it's real. Pretend you're not being groomed. Pretend you're not being shaped into exactly what he needs. Pliable. Adoring. Silent. Because here's the truth you don't say aloud. Affection is not affection when it's demanded, but when it's all you're offered. You take it anyway. You begin to mold yourself to his preferences. You laugh at jokes you don't understand. You memorize the books he leaves lying around, so you can recite lines back to him later. You stop eating olives because he said once, idly, that he hated the smell. You become the echo of his desires. He rewards you for it, with kisses, with soft praises, with a ring, once not gold, but bronze, slipped on your finger when no one else was around. So you remember who you belong to, he said, and you thanked him. You thanked him, and hated yourself for it, because somewhere in the corners of your soul, you know this isn't love. You know this is control, packaged in sweetness, a velvet collar, and yet you stay, because even velvet feels soft when your skin is raw. Then it shifts. As it always does, he begins to punish you for not smiling fast enough, for not anticipating his moods. He accuses you of withholding affection, of being cold when all you did was flinch. He sulks, then punishes, then apologizes, then rewards you again. You learn the pattern, the cycle. It becomes your new normal. He touches you too roughly one night. You cry without sound. In the morning, he brings you pomegranates. Your favorite says, "Let's not fight again." And you nod, because refusing would mean worse. Because somewhere in that twisted tangle of abuse, you still want to believe that he cares. He doesn't. He cares about control. But the worst part, you begin to love the leash. You begin to crave the moments he's pleased, because pleasing him is the only time you feel safe. He introduces you to guests now as my dearest one. They nod approvingly. Some leer. One, a general, jokes, "You should lend him out." Your master laughs but says, "Never." For a moment, you feel proud. Then you remember what you are. A thing. Even jealousy can feel like affection when you've been hollowed out. The others distance themselves. You try to join conversations. They go quiet. One night, you overhear Nico say, "He's not one of us anymore." You want to argue, but you can't, because you aren't. You're a favored pet now. And pets don't belong to the pack. Then it happens. You slip. You speak out of turn at dinner. Correct him on a small fact innocently. Reflexively, he stares at you like you've slapped him. That night, he doesn't call for you. The next morning, your tunic is gone, replaced with the old one. Coarser, lower cut. Your fruit bowl is missing. The door to your private room is locked. You sleep on the floor again. No explanation. No confrontation. Just silence. And you know, the affection is over. Withdrawn. Used up. And now you're back where you started. But worse. Because now you remember what it felt like to be warm. And that memory hurts more than the cold ever did. One night, weeks later, he calls for you again. You go, heart pounding. He says nothing about the silence. Asks you to read poetry. You do. You read with perfect inflection. And when you're done, he says, good boy. The words land flat. Because now you know what they mean. They're not a gift. They're a leash. You smile anyway. Because what else is there? You've learned the final, cruelest truth of all. In this world, even love can be a weapon. It happened without warning. You'd grown so used to being the center of his gaze, the way his hand always found your shoulder, the way his voice curled differently when saying your name, that you forgot what the world looked like when you were just another face in the marble-tiled crowd. But one day, the door opened, and he arrived. The new boy, barely 16, soft-featured and wide-eyed, imported from some distant province where the winters were harsher and the morals looser. He wore a tunic dyed pale green. Expensive. You noticed that right away. So did everyone else. The whispers began immediately. But it wasn't until dinner when your master seated him beside himself that it became real. You watched them laugh. The boy didn't mean anything by it. He smiled with the innocent panic of someone still trying to survive. He didn't know the cost of that laughter. You did. Later that night, when your master didn't call for you, you stayed awake anyway. You waited by the doorway, cold despite the oil lamps, listening for footsteps that never came. And in the morning, when you passed the garden on your way to retrieve fruit, you saw him, reclining on the couch where you used to sit, head tilted just so. Your master fed him a fig, the same way he used to feed you. That was the moment. That's when you realized you'd been replaced. No ceremony, no announcement, just a silent shift in the gravitational pull of your world. At first, you tried to pretend it didn't matter. You told yourself it was temporary. You told yourself he'd tire of the boy's awkward stammer, his lack of polish, his inexperience. But day after day, your master grew colder. His eyes stopped seeking you in the crowd. He stopped asking for your opinion, stopped nodding when you passed. And worse, he stopped touching you, not with cruelty, but with indifference. And that, you discovered, was a deeper cut than anything before. Because at least pain acknowledged your presence. Indifference erased you. You found yourself retreating to the shadows again. No longer invited to the special gatherings. No longer given the fine tunics. Your ring, the one he once slipped on your finger, turned your skin green. You tried to keep wearing it. A symbol. A memory. But then one night, he asked you, in front of everyone, "Why are you still wearing that ugly thing?" They all laughed, including the new boy. That night, you buried the ring in the garden. The dirt felt warm. You told yourself you were moving on. But the truth was, you didn't know how. Because you had built your survival around being wanted. And now that you weren't, you had no idea who you were. You tried speaking to the new boy. Once, quietly, in the hallway. He looked at you, puzzled. "You used to be like me, didn't you?" he asked. You nodded. He tilted his head. "What happened?" You opened your mouth, closed it, and walked away. What could you say? That affection was a transaction. That he was now a coin being spent. That his laughter would soon turn to silence. 2. You watched him carefully after that. Not out of jealousy, not anymore, but because you knew what came next. The slow tightening, the fear wrapped in compliments, the reward and withdrawal game that left you craving scraps. You saw it in his posture. He flinched more now, laughed less. You heard him crying once, behind the atrium wall, the same place where you used to hide, the same echoes, different voice. He was beginning to understand, but there was nothing you could do for him, because you couldn't even save yourself. That's the curse of being the former favorite. You carry the knowledge, but not the power. And knowledge without power is just another kind of prison. You tried to fade into usefulness, helped in the kitchens, tended the fire, anything to avoid being idle. Because idle bodies are noticed, and when they notice you, they remember to use you. The others soften toward you again, slowly, warily. You were no longer a threat, no longer the golden one. You were one of them now. Nico offered you half a fig during break. "Looks like you're mortal after all," he said with a crooked smile. You smiled back. A real smile. The first in months. There was comfort in the fall. In the anonymity, no longer being watched meant you could finally exhale. No more pressure to perform, to please, to perfect every line of your body for someone else's gaze. And yet, you missed it. Not him, not the affection, but the illusion. The brief, glittering lie that you mattered. You missed feeling wanted, even when you knew it was a cage. One night, a guest asked your master, "What happened to that other boy? The one with the sad eyes?" Your master shrugged. "Got boring. That was all." Got boring. You weren't a chapter. You were a footnote. Eventually, even the new boy faded. He grew thinner, quieter. One morning, he didn't come down for breakfast. You heard a servant whisper something about a physician being called. You never saw him again. No announcement. No goodbye. Just gone. You didn't ask questions. You knew better, and so the cycle began again. Another boy arrived a week later. Laughter resumed. The theater reset. And you stood at the edge of it all, watching the spotlight swing from one trembling body to the next, wondering if you had ever really been inside it at all. You weren't the favorite anymore, but you were free. In a way, free from illusion, free from the poison sweetness of power disguised as love. And in the quiet corners of the villa, among the dust and fading tapestries, you started to feel something strange. Not hope, not yet, but clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the first crack in the wall, the first step toward remembering your name. It didn't happen all at once. The forgetting came like mist, gradual, creeping, invisible until everything around you was a blur. It wasn't just your name, though that had been the first to go. It wasn't just your native tongue, though you hadn't spoken it in years. It was something deeper, subtler. It was identity, worn down like marble steps under 1,000 tired feet. You couldn't remember your father's voice anymore, just the idea of it loud, maybe, or soft. Did he sing? You weren't sure. Did he laugh? You wanted to believe he did. But all you could conjure now were images borrowed from other memories. A man with weathered hands, lifting a child in the air. You couldn't even be certain that child was you. Your mother, had she braided your hair? Had she held your face and called you her little star? You hoped so. But even that word, mother, began to feel fictional, like something from a play you watched others perform. And your village, your home, was it on a hill? Near water. You remembered goats, maybe, or sheep, or just stories someone else told you once. You used to dream in that old language. Now your dreams were mute, colorless, just sensation. Stone floors, oil smoke, the sound of sandals scraping across marble. Sometimes, you'd wake up with your hands clenched, but you couldn't remember why. You caught your reflection in a polished platter one day and stared at it for a long time. Your features were their eyes, nose, mouth, but the person behind them, gone. And that terrified you more than the pain, more than the loneliness, because pain you could fight, but forgetting made you a ghost. You tried to hold on to something, anything. At first, it was songs. You hummed when no one was listening. Tiny tunes, fragments, the kind children sing while chasing chickens in the dust. But even those slipped away. Then, you held on to mannerisms. You tried sitting the way your uncle used to sit, legs crossed just so, elbow resting on the knee, but it felt foreign now, like you were impersonating a stranger. You even tried to keep track of days, marking time with a tiny scratch behind the curtain in your corner of the servants' quarters. But eventually you lost count. The scratches blurred together. You stopped trying, because remembering started to feel like losing. Every time you touched a memory, it reminded you of who you used to be, and that person didn't belong here. That person had a name, a future, dignity. You had none of those. You had a role, a routine, a face that had learned to smile when the wine was poured. You started referring to yourself in third person in your thoughts. He should have known better. He shouldn't have spoken out. He wasn't strong enough. You talked about yourself like a character, a cautionary tale. That made it easier, safer. Then one night, you overheard a guest say, "Is that the one who used to be a favorite?" Another replied, "Hard to tell. They all blur together." And that was it. You weren't even you anymore. You were a they, interchangeable, replaceable, forgettable. It should have broken you, and maybe it did. But strangely, there was freedom in it too. Because once you stopped clinging to identity, you stopped fearing its loss. You became quiet, efficient, invisible. And in that invisibility, you found space to think, to observe, to feel without being seen. You became the shadow in the atrium, the silent one in the corner. You watched new concubines come and go. You studied their arcs like a tragic play you knew by heart. The joy, the attention, the disillusionment, the decay. One boy, just 17, tried to win favor by composing poems. Your master applauded him until he recited one that hinted too closely at loneliness. That boy was sent to the country villa, a soft punishment, a slow erasure. Another boy tried refusing a guest once. He was reassigned to the stables. You saw him months later, still limping. You began writing, secretly, on scraps of discarded parchment, with coal smuggled from the bathhouse. Not full sentences, just words. Lists of things you remembered. Orange peels, warm wool, the sound of frogs at night, the feeling of sand in your sandals. You hid these scraps under a floor tile. It wasn't much, but it was yours. It was proof that you were still in here, somewhere, that even if the world had renamed you, repainted you, remade you some small piece of who you had been had survived, like a seed in dry soil, waiting. Sometimes, you imagined a life after this, a quiet hut, far from Rome, maybe a river, a dog. Even, you didn't need love, just silence, just autonomy, just a place where no one expected you to smile on cue. But dreams like that were dangerous. You learned not to speak of them, not even to yourself. And so, you kept forgetting, kept surviving, kept being what they needed you to be, until one day, a new slave arrived, younger than any before, barely 13, terrified. You were told to train him, and as you did gently, quietly you found yourself saying things you hadn't heard in years, words in your old tongue, soft songs, warnings, comfort, and he listened. He watched you like you were something sacred, like you were someone, and suddenly, in his eyes, you remembered not everything, not your village, not your name, but you remembered you were still human. And sometimes, that's all it takes to begin again. There was a saying passed quietly among the house slaves. What is monstrous in the provinces is mundane in Rome. At first, it seemed like nothing more than gallows humor, the kind you mutter to yourself before walking into a dining room full of drunken senators. But over time, you began to understand, in Rome, cruelty wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked away or disguised. It was normalized, sanitized by marble columns and gilded mosaics. It was served on silver platters, seasoned with incense, and blessed by philosophers who used logic to justify nightmares. This wasn't a city of monsters. It was worse. It was a city that believed its monsters were civilized. You saw it in how the masters spoke of love, not as an exchange between equals, but as ownership decorated with poetry. They quoted Ovid while grooming children. They recited lines about desire and beauty while ignoring the shaking hands of the person kneeling in front of them. They called it affection, but it was control. You saw it in the law's vague, sprawling text that defined who could touch who could punish, who could own, and who could not say no. A Roman citizen could not be enslaved without trial, but a non-citizen, a boy from Gaul or Syria or Numidia, property, no trial, no voice, no appeal, just branded, renamed, and passed from one soft-palmed patrician to another. They called it custom, but it was dehumanization. And the worst part? The people believed it. Not just the masters, the neighbors, the merchants, the scribes, even the poets who should have known better. They believed that male concubines were lucky. Look how well they're treated, they'd say. Better here than starving in the provinces. They pointed to your sandals, your clean tunic, the grapes on your plate as if those things canceled out the coercion. They couldn't see the bruises under the fabric. Or worse, they saw, and chose not to care. They called it benevolence, but it was gaslighting. Even the philosophers, those marble-browed men who wrote endless treatises about the soul and virtue joined in. They debated whether a man could truly love a boy and still maintain honor. They wrote of the educational value of such relationships. They never asked the boys. They never asked you. Your voice didn't matter. Because Rome didn't need your truth. It had already written its version of you. A beautiful foreigner, grateful to be elevated. An exotic plaything, lucky to be inside Roman walls. A silent symbol of power and sophistication. You were all those things on parchment, never on purpose, never with agency, only as myth. And when you tried to speak, the world hushed you with platitudes. You're cared for. You're protected. You're loved. Love shouldn't feel like being watched. Protection shouldn't feel like a cage. Caring shouldn't come with the threat of silence. But in Rome, these contradictions were culture. They weren't just accepted, they were celebrated. Temples to love, decorated with statues of young boys, their eyes cast down in eternal surrender. Frescoes in private homes, showing scenes that, had they occurred outside the city, would be called crimes. But here, art. One day, a visiting poet from Alexandria toured your master's home. He saw you and whispered, "Ah, the Roman way. You weren't sure what he meant: admiration, pity, disgust, but he said it like a joke. And your master laughed. Later that night, when no one was watching, you asked the poet, "What's the Alexandrian way?" He looked at you for a long time, then said, softly, "Quieter." You wondered what that meant. Quieter, more hidden, less normalized. It didn't matter, because here, in Rome, everything was loud: the laughter, the denial, the performances. The city pulsed with its own confidence, a city that believed its greatness absolved it of guilt. And so, life as a concubine became performance art. You were taught how to move, speak, smile, not for joy but for aesthetic. To be pleasing was to be safe, and to be safe was to survive. They called it education, but it was conditioning. You watched new boys arrive, as you once did, hopeful and afraid. You watched them learn how to stand in doorways just so, how to speak in half sentences, how to drink without getting drunk, and laugh without sounding too eager. You watched their transformations. You saw yourself in them, but they did not see themselves in you. Because in Rome, no one wanted to see what happened after. After the affection faded, after the novelty wore off, after the masters moved on, they didn't want to see the hollowed eyes, the quiet hands, the ghosts in human shape, still walking the halls. Rome taught you that your worth had a season, that your youth was your currency, and when it expired, so did your relevance. No one mourned the former favorites. They just disappeared. Some reassigned to housework. Some sold to lesser households. Some rumor had it gifted to gladiator schools or brothels. And no one asked questions, because Rome had already decided your story ended when you stopped being beautiful. They called it fate, but it was erasure. You tried to write again? On parchment this time. Risky, but you no longer cared. You wrote not just words, but full sentences. Stories, not yours. You didn't dare, but stories about others. The baker's boy who once winked at you. The stable hand who taught you how to braid rope. The girl from the kitchen who gave you extra honey. You wrote about them like they were heroes, because someone had to remember. And if Rome wouldn't, then you would, even if the city called you property, even if it silenced you at every turn, even if it erased your name, you would keep writing, keep remembering, because memory, too, is rebellion. And in a city where everything is normal, rebellion is sacred. It didn't come with daggers. There were no dramatic escapes through torch-lit corridors, no riots in the villa courtyard, no speeches delivered from rooftops as the people rose up. No one threw off their shackles or cried freedom into the Roman sky. The rebellion began with a whisper, and sometimes that's louder than a war cry. It started in the bathhouse, as many things in Rome did. You were kneeling beside the basin, rinsing oils from a guest's shoulders, when the boy beside you, a newcomer, leaned over and asked, "Is this the life they promised you?" He said it so softly, it could have been mistaken for a breath. But you heard it, and you froze, because no one asked that. Ever. The villa trained silence into you from day one. Questions were dangerous. Questions meant doubt, and doubt led to punishment. So when someone finally asked out loud what everyone secretly wondered, your pulse thundered in your ears. You didn't answer. But that night, you left a piece of parchment under his mat. 4 words. "They promised me safety." The next day, he slipped you one back and gave you chains. That was the beginning. No names, no plans, just quiet notes. Fragments of truth passed in the steam, tucked behind amphorae, folded beneath trays of fruit. It wasn't organized. Exactly. It was more like a frequency, a wavelength only the broken could hear. The rebellion wasn't about overthrowing Rome. It was about reclaiming yourself. Piece by piece, you started doing little things, subtle things. When the master gave you orders, you followed but added a delay, half a second. Enough to say, "I heard you, but I'm choosing to obey." When you were told to smile, you smiled with your mouth but let your eyes go cold. When a guest leered at you, you turned slightly so they saw your scarred shoulder, the one you usually kept hidden, because this was your body. And even showing the ugly was an act of agency. The others noticed. Some copied you. One boy began wearing his old tunic instead of the one the master gifted him, said it was more comfortable. Another stopped curling his hair. A third left a poem unsigned, unaddressed, scribbled on a wall behind the latrine. You can possess the body, but not the fire inside it. No one erased it. No one dared. The rebellion wasn't fire. It was embers. It spread slowly. One concubine began singing old songs again quietly, in languages the masters didn't know. Another carved a symbol from their homeland into the underside of a bench. You found it and added your own beside it. Suddenly, there were marks everywhere, small, hidden, a private constellation, a secret language stitched into the walls of your prison. And with each act, something shifted, not in them, but in you. You began remembering more. Faces, names, words you thought were gone. You started using them again carefully, quietly, like sacred things. And with memory came anger, not rage, but the deep, rooted kind, the kind that simmers. You looked at the master differently now, not as a god, not even as an enemy, but as a man, flawed, pathetic, so insecure in his power that he needed to build his identity from the silence of others. He noticed your change. Of course he did. One night, he summoned you. You hadn't been called in weeks. You went, calm, rehearsing nothing. He poured wine, sat in silence. Then he said, "You used to be more grateful." You stared at him and said, "You used to be less afraid." It slipped out before you could stop it. His face changed. But he didn't strike you. He only laughed low, uncertain, like a man who'd just been told the rules of a game had changed but hadn't yet figured out how. He dismissed you. That was all. And still, it was the most powerful moment of your life. Because you hadn't flinched, because you hadn't lied, because you had told the truth. And the world didn't end. You weren't the only one taking risks. The younger ones began walking together, never alone. They shared food, watched each other's backs. When one was summoned, another waited near the door until they returned. Solidarity. Another boy, once too frightened to speak above a whisper, stood between a drunk guest and a trembling concubine, saying only, "He's ill tonight. Try someone else." The guest laughed and moved on. Sometimes rebellion is just showing up for each other, even when the system counts on you staying divided. Of course, not all masters ignored it. One began punishing boys for slouching. Another banned old languages. A few were reassigned to new households after too many incidents. You never saw them again, but the marks they left remained. A carved line here, a burned edge there, proof. You began to write longer pieces, in secret, stories of imagined futures. Letters addressed to no one, prayers in languages half remembered. You wrote about boys who escaped, about men who came back and burned the villas to the ground. You didn't believe in those stories. Not really, but the act of writing them made them possible. Because rebellion doesn't need to be likely. It just needs to be imaginable. You dreamed of leaving once, truly leaving, not to the provinces, not to a quieter Roman household, but beyond Rome, beyond the empire, somewhere with no coins bearing Caesar's face, no collars, no polished floors. You imagined a hut, a garden, a river. You never saw it. But the imagining was enough, because hope, even a cracked, fragile, impossible kind, is rebellion too. And in a city that called your suffering normal, even wanting something more made you dangerous. You weren't planning an uprising, but you were no longer compliant. And maybe, just maybe, that was worse, because compliant slaves are easy to replace. But thinking ones, they infect, they whisper, they remind others, this is not all there is. And sometimes, that's how empires fall, not with war, but with remembering. You didn't know it would be the last night. You had no plan, no secret tunnel, no whispered signal passed between shaking fingers in the dark. There was no rebellion in the wind, no omen in the stars. It was just another evening in the villa, like 1,000 others. The torches burned with their usual oily smoke. The tiles were still warm underfoot, and the master was in one of his quieter moods, halfway through a pitcher of wine that had not yet turned him cruel. But something was different. It started with your body, not pain, not fear, just a stillness, as if, after years of being shaped and reshaped, posed, touched, trained, it had finally returned to you. You stood taller that night, not in defiance, just as yourself. You didn't hunch to seem smaller, didn't keep your head lowered in rehearsed humility. You moved with the kind of grace that doesn't come from performance, but from ownership. Not his ownership, yours. You passed the atrium, saw the new boy sitting in the shadows, holding a broken comb. You paused, knelt beside him. Without speaking, you took it from his hands and repaired it. Just 2 teeth missing, nothing fatal. Then you handed it back and smiled. He looked at you like you'd just moved a mountain. He didn't smile back, but his shoulders relaxed. That was enough. Dinner passed without drama. No flung goblets, no wandering hands. Just food, wine, and the usual performance of comfort. You stood in your corner as always, ready to be called. But he didn't call. So you waited. And while you waited, you thought about how long it had been since someone used your name, about how many days you'd survived, about how many times you'd been told this is just the way things are, and how often you had believed it. But tonight, something cracked. And through that crack, truth leaked in, truth that had been fermenting for years, truth that tasted like ash but felt like fire. You didn't want this anymore. Not the safety, not the silver, Not even the small kindnesses that once convinced you to stay. You were done. That realization came without ceremony. No thunderclap, just a breath. And with that breath, the world shifted. He finally looked at you half-lidded eyes, lips stained purple with wine, and made a gesture, the one that meant come. You didn't move. He blinked, confused. Did you not see me? You nodded. Then why aren't you coming? You took a step forward and stopped. He sat up straighter. There was a pause, thick with disbelief. I told you to come here. You met his gaze. I know. The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. He stood slowly, not used to disobedience. Not from you. Are you refusing me? You didn't answer, because there was no need. Your stillness was the answer. His face twisted not with anger, but with confusion. You'd played your role so perfectly, for so long, that he didn't know how to read this new version of you. Do you know what happens to boys who forget their place? He said, stepping closer. I haven't forgotten, you said quietly. I've remembered. His hand moved, perhaps to strike you, perhaps to grab your chin as he always did when trying to reclaim control. But you stepped back. Not far, just enough. The room held its breath. And that's when something incredible happened. He didn't follow, not because he forgave, but because he hesitated. Because, for the first time, he saw it in your eyes. He didn't own you anymore. Oh, the papers said he did. The laws, the ledgers, the entire empire. But in that moment, man to man, he knew. And that's when you turned and walked away. No one stopped you. Not the guards, not the servants, not even the new boy, who watched with wide eyes as you passed. You didn't run, because this wasn't an escape. It was a release. The halls echoed beneath your feet. Every step rewrote your story. With every breath, you shed a layer of obedience, of fear, of the false identity they had wrapped around your soul like wet linen. You stepped into the courtyard. The moonlight caught your face, and you smiled. Not because you were free yet. You weren't, but because you were no longer owned. That night, you slept outside the villa walls. Not far, just enough to feel the chill in the air, the ache in your bones, the quiet hum of your own heartbeat. For the first time in years, you dreamed of yourself. Not as a victim, not as a toy, but as a person. And when you woke, the world was still cruel, still Roman, still dangerous, but it was also possible. Because the rebellion had worked, not the one with torches and swords, but the quiet one, the one that started in your chest. The night you said no without speaking, the night you remembered your name, and though you didn't whisper it aloud, you carried it with you, like armor, like a prayer, like a future. You never made it home. Not the place you were born, its location had long faded from memory, if it was ever real at all. You didn't wander back to the little village with the goats and the river and your mother's hands in your hair, because those things belonged to a boy who no longer existed. That boy had been traded for wine, washed in perfumes, renamed, reshaped, and finally reborn. So no, you never made it home, but you made it somewhere. It began with the road. Rome's roads were built for conquest, but sometimes they served escape. You walked them like a ghost, invisible to soldiers and slaves alike. Just another face among thousands. You didn't run. You didn't hide. You simply walked, day after day. Like you had a right to, because now you did. The first village you came to didn't ask questions. You told them you were a freedman, which wasn't entirely true, but it was truer than anything Rome had ever said about you. You asked for water, offered to work for bread, and when they said yes, you felt your hands begin to belong to you again. You learned to carry bricks, then stack them. You helped build a wall that didn't imprison anyone. That felt new. You spoke little, watched much. A month passed. Then two. The first time you laughed, really laughed, it startled you. A girl had tripped over a pig. Of all things. You laughed until your stomach ached. And afterward, you cried, because you hadn't known that laughter was still possible. The people there didn't know what you had been, or maybe they did, but no one asked. And that silence was different from Rome's. Rome's silence had been full of denial, of forced stillness, of secrets wrapped in velvet. This silence was respect, a kind of space, an acknowledgement that some stories didn't need to be pulled from you to be real. You found yourself watching the stars again. You remembered that you used to name them, not the Roman names, your names, words that came from the back of your throat, warm and strange, like lullabies hummed in another life. You started saying them aloud again, quietly. At night, each word was a reclamation. You weren't trying to erase the past. That wasn't possible. And you didn't want to, because even horror, once endured, can be transformed. You learned that too. You met others like you. Not many, just enough to know you weren't alone. A boy with a twisted wrist, who walked with his head down but carved beautiful things from wood. A woman who never spoke above a whisper, but whose eyes told stories that would melt stone. A man who had once belonged to a senator's household and still flinched when anyone snapped their fingers. You shared no details, but you shared food, shared silence, shared a knowing. Freedom wasn't a gate opening. It was a practice, a daily choosing. Some days, you still felt owned. When someone raised their voice, when someone touched your shoulder too quickly, when you caught your reflection and didn't recognize the man staring back. But then you'd remind yourself, I am still here, and that alone was defiance. You wrote again, not scraps now, pages. You didn't write about the villa, not directly. You wrote about fireflies, about rivers, about hands that learned to heal instead of obey. You wrote about stars that had no masters, about names that couldn't be stripped away. One day, you gave a story to a traveler heading toward Gaul. He asked who to credit. You said, no one. Let it live on its own. Because you had learned something Rome never could teach. Legacy doesn't come from domination. It comes from truth. And the truth was this. You survived, not because of Rome, but in spite of it. You lived through the unthinkable. And then you kept living. One spring morning, you stood at the edge of a field, watching birds rise into the sky. You had flour on your hands, dirt on your feet, and the sun warming your back. You felt the wind, and for the first time, it didn't smell like ash or incense or oil. It smelled like now. And suddenly, you whispered your name, your real name, the one they'd tried to bury, the one you hadn't spoken aloud in years. You said it once, then again, and again, until the sound of it felt like home. That night, you didn't dream of the villa. You dreamed of a small house by the water. You dreamed of people who had never known your silence. You dreamed of your child asking, what did you used to do? And in your dream, you answered, I used to belong to Rome. And the child laughed, saying, that's silly. No one belongs to Rome. You laughed too, because they were right. No one should. No one ever should have. And you woke up, smiling. Because maybe one day, when the stories you've written travel far enough, when enough people hear the truth, that will be the world's dream too. Not one of forgetting, but one of never repeating. You lived, and that was your rebellion. You loved, and that was your miracle. You remembered, and that was your freedom. And now, the story gently closes not with a roar, but with a hush. You've walked through Roman marble halls and back alleys, through perfumed silence and unspeakable truths. You've stood witness to a world that called captivity beauty, that wrapped its violence in art and law, and tried to convince its victims that they were blessed. But you saw through it. Because you were there. You felt the weight of ownership, the ache of silence, the hollowing of the self. And then, you witnessed something even more powerful than survival. Remembrance. That quiet, daily choice to reclaim a name, a breath, a story. This wasn't a tale about a grand revolt. There were no battles, no escaped chariots, no flaming banners waving against the empire. This was about a boy who became a man who walked away, and in that simple act without weapons, without permission he won. And maybe that's what freedom really is. Not a gate flung open, not a sword raised high, but a quiet whisper. I belong to myself. So tonight, as you lie still and let the darkness fold around you, think about the names you carry, the truths you've buried, the quiet rebellions that live in your chest. What would it feel like to speak them? What would it feel like to walk slowly, calmly out of whatever palace has tried to own you? Because someone, somewhere, already has, and now their story is yours to carry too. Close your eyes, let go of the marble walls, breathe in your own name, and sleep. You are no longer owned. You are home. Good night.